Okay, welcome back. Are you all well-fed, well-recovered, relaxed? My name is Nead. I'm chairing this session on the Moving exhibition, which is really about the interfaces between film and exhibitions, and between filmmaking and curating. And I think it's going to be a really interesting, stimulating panel that will kind of rouse you from your lunch relaxation. I'm not going to go into our speakers' biographies in detail. I'll just direct you to the PMC website, because they've got long and very stellar biographies, and the details are there for you to look at. I will simply say, their names and what they do. In the order of speaking, the first will be S.A. Onojeruo, who is a London-based curator and film producer whose practice focuses on reimagining institutional spaces and structures for the bodies that are often marginalised or othered or excluded, I guess. And our second speaker is Lily Ford, who is also a filmmaker and independent scholar. And she produces creative documentary features, often with the Derek Jarman Lab at Birkbeck University of London, and also has directed a number of films on history and art. So what I'll do is we'll have Essa, if you could speak first, and then we'll move on to Lily, and then we'll have a discussion and Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at this panel. For this presentation, I wanted to speak about an exhibition by Anthea Hamilton called Cabbage for 5 Ways. I wanted to explore a radical idea from British art history, Richard Hamilton's claim that an exhibition is the kinetic interaction of an audience within a contrived space. Using the exhibition by Anthea Hamilton, which was a performance-based and incorporated embodied relational and as well as smell, it was a work I helped to acquire, and I wanted to think about how this exhibition not only showed the artist's intent, but built in a living archive. Ultimately, I'll be questioning how we preserve exhibitions that are about movement, space, and lived experiences. So in 1957, Richard Hamilton co-curated an exhibition which was showcased at the ICA. It avoided traditional artworks and instead used suspend colour screens, transparent panels, and carefully controlled lighting to create an immersive, abstract environment. Richard Hamilton's definition of an exhibition as kinetic interactions assumed a physical audience navigating the space. It shifted the focus from objects to the audience as co-curators of meaning. However, photos froze moments but lost the energy that was within the exhibition space. As a response, he was able to use film to capture capture the motion, but Hamilton's theory demanded lived bodies in real spaces. In contrast to this, Anthea Hamilton's Cabbage for 5 Ways pushes this by turning performers into embodied archive. Her work demands that we expand documentation beyond capturing the kinetic, preserving not just movement, but the sweat, the scent, the solidarity of bodies navigating trauma. Because of this, it signals a broader shift in art history, away from passively looking at space towards actively caring for it, holding, or engaging with the lived felt experience of the bodies within the artwork. So in 2020, Anthea Hamilton created Cabbage for 5 Ways, which was commissioned by Walker Art Centre, Minneapolis, as part of the Paradox of the Stillness, which was a group exhibition that explored the intersections between performance and the visual art. The show tested the boundaries between stillness and motion as well as time. Within the work, Anthea was able to create a surreal green-tiled environment which was part bedroom, part cabbage patch. The set was both domestic and otherworldly, providing a controlled, embodied space where performers became the kinetic sculptures. Anthea was looking to explore how bodies and language relates to familiar places. The choreography and set design were rooted in the bio qualities of a cabbage, its fractal patterns, and this idea of the bolt that the cabbage has a response to trauma, which is an act of self-protection where the plant transforms itself into a tough and bitter flower which is no longer edible. There were 5 Minneapolis-based performers who she worked with a creative perfumer in London to develop a unique scent for each performer. The scent was tailored to the individual's biochemistry. The performers were asked to work up a sweat and then send an item of clothing to Anthea. The perfumer was able to then kind of highlight different scents and notes to create a perfume that would be unique to them. While we used film to document the performances and the exhibition, we were able to capture gestures of artworks, movement, but we were not able to capture stuff like the semiotics, the smells, the emotional dimension of the performances, and interactions with the audiences as well. So when the artwork was acquired by Walker Art Gallery, it was important to start to think about the epistemal constraints that footage would have, and its failure to also be able to detail certain aspects of the work, such as the smell, the embodied knowledge that each performer had, the labour ethics. Also, as this work was in the midst of the wage against the WAG sort of protests, which demanded better pay and rights for producers and workers within the arts. As a result of looking at other research centres and thinking about how different institutions collects live and performance work, one of the key research centres that stood out was Reshaping the Collectible, which was situated at Tate, which specifically looked at how to acquire live and performance work. We were able to come up with the idea of licensed teacher. So essentially, this would have been anyone who had been within the work and had gone through the process of becoming a performer would then be able to teach another performer about the work so they could also perform the work. They would train others through touch, scent, rehearsal, and shared memory. In this way, the performance is not just about the movement and choreography. It's about also creating the right working conditions. So again, just thinking about like the time and space that this work was created in, being able to demand better pay. The work was also made in the same state George Floyd was murdered in 2020 at the same time. So I think there was a lot of heightened tensions and demands for recognition of emotional labour when coming into work as well. So when thinking about the concept of art becoming public, this artwork in particular it persists as not only as a static entity, but a corporal dialogue across time, space, and bodies. So the idea of art becoming public isn't limited to just the audience, but also the contributors, the politics, economics, and situation, and the place that it's embedded in as well. In conclusion, Richard Hamilton's theory anticipates film's capacity to archive kinetic exhibitions and experiences. Yet Anthea Hamilton's exhibition reveals that art engages multi-central, politically embedded embodies, whereas film functions not as a comprehensive documentation, but as a catalyst for broader ecosystems of knowledge. This idea of licensed teacher model proposed a radical shift, preserving British art kinetic legacies, requiring privileging human interbody transmissions along technological mediations. To truly honour a work like Cabbage 4 or 5 ways, we have to preserve the relationship, the space and experiences. And in this way, art becomes not just public, but through the viewership, it also becomes stewardship. Yeah.
Okay. I feel a bit aggressed by this microphone. Hello, I'm Lily Ford. As Lynn said, I'm a filmmaker. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Claudia, for organising everything. It's a really interesting day. I'm going to, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do because I wrote it down. Non-fiction filmmaking and curating an exhibition have much in common. Both are acts of bringing to life or activating art and ideas. One, a temporary assembly of durable parts to be experienced in space, although now, after your talk, I say I'm kind of reassessing that idea. But anyway, I'll go on. And the other, film, a more lasting assembly of ephemeral contributions to be experienced in time. Both are intended for collective viewership, and maybe we'll talk more about viewership at the end. My filmmaking practice has been facilitated by exhibitions, which validate a subject and generate commissions, as well as a fluorescence of scholarship and interest. But I'd like to spend time here considering what film has to offer that's different from an exhibition. And to that end, I'm going to present, after this is a kind of taster reel of where I am at the moment with other work, but I'm going to present a few clips from films I've made that are related to exhibitions, sites, or works of art. So to start with, I just wanted to put a quote up. Hopefully it will arrive in a minute. Yes, there we go. So this is a quote that is useful for me in thinking about what film, for me, is and isn't. And let's say it's here, cinema, although we could almost substitute in exhibition curating. For cinema, that might be interesting to do. But anyway, cinema isn't a technique of displaying images, it's an art of showing. And showing is a gesture that demands looking and watching. Without this gesture, there is just imagery. But if something is shown, someone must acknowledge its receipt. And that's by Serge Danet, who was a French New Wave film critic, wrote for Cahiers du Cinéma and places like that. So I am a believer in film's theatrical demand of undivided attention from start to finish, as opposed to looped and drop-in viewership, which is another form of film kind of within the exhibition and gallery context. I think in our current moment of audiovisual abundance and multiple devices that we can view on, it's worth making a demand for attention from viewers. Because in non-fiction filmmaking, just as in fiction, we create imaginary worlds. And those worlds only function in the viewer's minds if they commit to the experience. And that is when they are moved. In my films, I'm primarily concerned to create an atmosphere, a space for thinking about the subject. The sensory channels available to me, visual, musical, ambient, and vocal, get assembled with care for the temporal value of pace and the spatial value of plausible sites and spaces. Working in the essay film tradition, I'm less concerned with documentary verisimilitude than to unfold some thoughts and examine some associations. Filmmaker Mark Cousins suggests that to make an essay film is to take an idea for a walk. I would suggest that the weather on that walk is important, and that's something I'm interested in setting. So as I assemble elements of the film, I'm concerned with how a viewer will feel. How will they be moved? When and how should the film move them? How can I marshal the natural human inclination to empathise and to interpret? How can I make the subject and my feelings about it land with them in the right way? So the films that I'll accept from here are all about paintings. They present the story that I consider most important about the subject. I'm just going to show you clips so you can go away and watch the whole thing if you like. They're all online. But I think in this way, the filmmaker is kind of a rival or counterpart to the curator, because we're examining the subject, taking a position, and mounting an interpretive show. In French and Spanish, mounting, monter, montage, montar, montaje, is also the word for editing. So first I'm going to share the beginning of the first film I directed, and I want to say thank you to Lynn, because this was an opportunity from Lynn to, let me just bring up the title, to direct my first film, having produced a number of creative documentaries. And this was a response to an exhibition that Lynn had curated at the Foundling Museum in the winter of 2015, I think. So 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago. And the exhibition brought together the Victorian trope of the fallen woman and the unmarried mother with a history of the women who made use of the Foundling Hospital, as it then was. So it was a kind of document of the exhibition, which was soon to close, but it was also, for me, introducing a reminder of the embodied reality that faced these women. Can I turn off the lights? Or could you turn off the lights? Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks a lot. It's complex.
This is a series of portraits. But the portraits are not of real women. They're of ideas. The happy mother. The exiled daughter. The prostitute. The suicide. They employ an array of signs and a roster of beautiful models to explore the vicissitudes of moral corruption, the apparently inevitable downfall wrought by the wrong expression and use of female sexuality. But alongside this gallery of chimeric, essentialized womankind is another group of women. Women represented only by their name, often not even written by their own hand. There is no surviving portrait of these women. Maids of all work, dressmakers, milliners. Indeed, there would ordinarily be little to show their existence, little trace of them in the archives, but for one fact, one flesh and blood fact.
So here the exhibition context is referenced and a narration delivered, but the infant shot, I hope, is unexpected and intimate. And by including the infant, I'm forcing new life into this older story. I'm making an appeal to viewers' non-linguistic, embodied knowledge and aiming to provoke an affective response, to awaken the feelings babies can give us of delight, duty, care, guilt. This sets up the painful dilemma running through the film of women having to petition the Foundling Hospital to accept their baby from them, to take them away, and undergoing an assessment of their virtue in a pre- or a postnatal state. So the film becomes part of the afterlife of the exhibition in its assembly of paintings and documents that the exhibition brought together, but also a personal interpretation of the broader story that the exhibition told. So rather than responding to a collection of paintings on a theme, my second and third clips are about sites and artists. Two house painters, in fact, in different ways. The Man Who Painted His House is a film about a small museum, well, based in a small museum. It's made with Dr. Vicky Mills, who's here today in the audience. And and it's about the Cambridge art workman David Parr. Vicky is undertaking a bigger research project on Victorian art workmanship. And this is a film that's funded by the Birkbeck Research Innovation Fund. And she wanted an entry into the subject that privileged the visual over the verbal. In particular, because we don't have any interpretation by Parr of his work. This is an empty house covered in David Parr's striking wall decorations that were painted over 40 years from the kind of late Victorian period into the, well, I guess spanning the turn of the 20th century. So from 1880s to 1920s. So with this film, we needed to create a dynamic of work and of busyness and to imagine the gestures behind the painting.
The time worked on the frieze and cornice. Painted 4 coats of white, 12 hours. Pounced the frieze, 2 hours. Painting in the colours, 4, 3, 13, 3, 10 hours. Outlining, 12 hours. The cornice colours, 7 hours. The flowers stencilled, 2 hours. More colours, 9 hours. The twist and varnishing, 8 hours. Lost. Somewhere between sunrise and sunset, 2 golden hours, each set with 60 diamond minutes. No reward was offered, as they are lost forever and ever.
So if the house is a time capsule, the film is a handling of the artefacts and a mobile and curious gaze. We break up the surfaces that must be left reverently intact in an exhibition context. Where Parr recorded only the technical processes involved in the house's long decoration, we make interpretations on a psychological level, pairing his notes with the gestures of making, and noting the resonance of that Victorian motto about time, placed in a room where Parr had sunk 85 hours, as you saw, into the creation of just one element in the room. The essay film form allows for an imaginative approach, infusing the house and objects with energy via the music, voice, and pace. So to finish, I want to show another clip about process. This is a film about the painter George Shaw, who jokes that he paints houses down the pub, but sort of paints houses in a very fine art context, as it's ended up being. And I made it as part of his first major retrospective, which was curated by Mark Hallett via this very institution and the Yale Centre for British Art some years ago. And for my film, I chose to look at Shaw's medium of choice, which is Humbrol enamel paint. Unusual choice for painting on canvas, quite difficult to work with, and has associations with like utility and sheds and DIY and model aeroplanes. So I'll show the clip.
If you look at the photographs or a watercolour or something in another medium of these images, nothing happens. They seem to be quite static, quite dead, quite forgettable, even from my point of view. So, but when they get rendered in this, that fight that I kind of go through, that's what lifts it up. So the paint has a sort of glamour to it. It's shiny. I think they look kind of wet. They always look kind of as though they're not finished. I quite like the idea of painting not as an object, but as a doing word. So it's always in it's an activity, not an object. See how I end up painting the same bit over and over again?
Yeah.
It's because I don't want to make it look like I've made an effort, so I'm sort of trying to create the tree just out of the twizzle of the paint.
Yeah. Why don't you want it to look like...
Well, I don't want it to look like I've kind of a ladybird book illustration. Because it's kind of quite easy to do. I could do a really tight drawing and then just colour it in. But I like it to kind of just look like it's just appeared. Which in some of the way it hovers between being paint and being like a twig,
Yeah.
keeps it sort of alive, really. Keeps it almost like half finished.
Yeah.
And as I've said before, trying to make a painting look like it's a living thing rather than a dead thing.
So I brought a macro lens to George's studio, right, which is a lens that magnifies a great deal, to get a really close view on the surface of his paintings. And this scene is just, well, the last scene of the film is essentially just a combination of two camera angles, paced in a way that shows us both working hard, concentrating, with the music and the distortion from my lens creating an otherworldliness that chimes with what George is saying. Painting as a doing word, an activity, not an object, which seems very apposite also to kind of some of the impulses that we've heard about this morning of kind of valuing art outside the institution a little bit more. And in this film, I'm trying to follow George into this suspension between representation and life. And something about those hexagonal bouquet spangles that the lens breaks the gleaming surface of his painting into, for me, really spoke to that. So just to conclude, where exhibitions offer presence, kinetic interactions, and the full aura of an artwork, film offers something different. I see this as freedom and possibility to associate by bringing together unexpected moments in the story world, to fragment and rework through filming and editing, and to chase reflections and meditative moments through music and pace. Film can move in parallel to exhibitions, employing affective dynamics to engage audiences, and crystallizing a moment in the experience of art. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. I think for those of us, and you know, I think we're all used to film as a kind of recording mechanism. You know, we watch films of art all the time on different kinds of broadcast and streaming platforms, and also, of course, now the films in cinemas of blockbuster exhibitions. And in those cases, it's sort of, it's simply a kind of an alternative, isn't it? It's a substitute. Whereas I think you're both arguing that film is actively doing something else. And so I guess the first question that I wanted to ask is, where do these films live? Where do they sit? How do they get seen? Because, you know, Lily, I haven't seen that film for quite a long time. And I just wonder about that question of where they live and how you feel about that. And there are some mics there.
Sure, thank you. That film, does that work? Yes, I might amplify it. Yeah. That film, Fallen Woman, languishes low down the Vimeo playlist on the internet. And that's something that I've learned in the intervening 10 years, is when you make a film, you can't just make the film and finish it, right? you've then got to think, okay, well, what's it for? Where's it going? Are we supposed to premiere it? Are we supposed to sort of keep it under a hat? Do we do a launch, etc., etc.? So the kind of apparatus that's around more commercial film and cinema, which I've been involved in as a producer, could also apply to these kinds of films. It depends on who's funded them, and what utility you think they'll have in those different spaces, whether in kind of cinema spaces, festivals, definitely, always good, and then perhaps more academic spaces as well, or whether you want it to be really freely accessible. Perhaps that's in the conditions of the funding. So I'm botching it because I don't really know the definitive answer how to, I don't know. It's difficult and particular, perhaps.
Okay, so let's hear your thoughts.
I think for the film of it was more of a documentation of the exhibition. So it would sit mostly in the archive, so there hasn't really been a reimagining or restaging of that particular film work. And even over lunch, we were talking about how, like, during COVID time, lockdown time, a lot of the generated video content was via Zoom as well. So it has very specific context, and whether that can be reshown is questionable, because it was more to kind of be able to be in that moment when you couldn't be in the space.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when you were describing the Hamilton work, I sort of thought, is this unfilmable? You know, can film do anything more? Or can it even come close to what the exhibit did in terms of this kind of multisensorial embodiment? And I remember also watching the PMC commissioned films of the Hugh Locke procession, and I kept on thinking the best shots are the ones that are right inside the procession, and mostly they were sort of trying to give you, I don't know, shots that encompassed it all rather than that sort of embodiment. So, you know, are there some works that are unfilmable, where film just can't do what the work did in the gallery?
I think your presentations made me think a lot about, I think if it was to be filmed to be reshown, maybe having that conversation with the artist about what the relationship would be with the lens and the performers, because I think for this specific work, Anthea's work that I spoke about, it was a lot about like her practice, which I think isn't as known as much, is about the relationship she has with the performers, the people who work on the work, so even like me as a producer on the work, which doesn't get seen. We also worked on later film works. We did a South Bank sculptural commission, which was a 24-hour film on like this massive screen outside the South Bank Centre, and a lot of it was a very long production process, because it was all about creating like relationships with the performers. We had loads of workshops of facilitations to kind of bring us together. A lot of that gets unseen. So she's trying to create a safe space within the institution, hence why there's always like a tiled or like some sort of set design. So I think if that was also thought of as an artwork in itself, perhaps that could be filmed and reshown. But I think the documentation that we did generate was more of a documentation to get a sense rather than like the actual work itself.
Yeah.
I would be fascinated to see that latter project that you were just kind of ideating there. My favourite bit of Planet Earth is making of, right? The making of Planet Earth at the end. Production context is so important, isn't it? And especially within that art world where perhaps the finished product gets all the attention. I also just wanted to mention, of course, where do these films get seen? Vicky and I screened the David Parr film a couple of weeks ago to loads of people in a church in Cambridge. So also just putting on those screenings for constituencies and groups of people who you think would like it is important and sort of part of the work. Someone has to do that work. It's often forgotten at the kind of budgeting and planning stage. And collective viewership, I think, is also interesting and important, perhaps leading us into the kind of art, people who go to an exhibition versus, or as well as people who sit together and watch a film. Maybe not in a cinema, but because it sort of breathes differently when there's people sitting there having reactions together, right?
Yeah. And I mean, just to continue with this idea of the artwork and the film and the relationship between those two elements. I mean, what does an artwork either lose or gain when it's transferred to the screen? I mean, what do you think are the losses or really positive about making films with and about art?
Shall I go?
Yeah.
You want to go?
I was going to say, I think a lot can be lost. I think in my practice, in the context of the exhibition I spoke about, there was so much emotional labour, a lot of politics, and just, a lot of that physicality. I think there was like a lot of feminist practice and career practices of creating space, of shared space, of support, and that also always happens in the in-between spaces, which film doesn't always capture. I guess if it is a film specifically about that, but I guess there is a lot lost, and hence why we came up with this idea of like embodying it within people who would be able to advocate for those ideas.
Yeah.
I'll come the opposite way and say there's kind of everything to be gained, controversially. Obviously, we're coming from different contexts of the kind of art that we're talking about, and I'm often dealing with artists who are dead. And often in my kind of scholarly work, well, always dealing with people who are dead in the past. And I think, for the reasons that I kind of elucidated, there's so much that we can do in film to add context and kind of bring to life, to use a useful cliche, that it really is just the approach that you set out when you decide what film you're making that will determine what's lost and gained, I suppose.
I mean, in a way, the kind of film adding context approach is quite a traditional one. I was watching Simon Sharma, The Power of Art, and he does a lot of that for the French Revolution and David, I mean, it was a pretty good film, actually, in a lot of ways. But I was interested in your film and of Shaw painting. For example, you went out of focus a few times. It was a handheld camera. So you were making decisions that was an appropriate way or an interest. I mean, why did you make those particular decisions?
Well, I think, as is often the way with film, lots of things aren't decisions that you make at the moment. They're mistakes that you decide to fold in, right? And I was having trouble focusing the lens, right? And I had a little monitor, but it was really difficult to sort of... I had technical things. I was trying to keep it still, and I couldn't. But I loved that. When I reviewed the footage, I was like, oh, what is this? I love this. And so I decided to incorporate it. I mean, all films involve shooting a ratio of kind of 90% stuff you don't use to 10% stuff you use, right? And just making those choices about what it is that you use and you don't use is kind of where the film is actually made, in my view, is the edit. Takes a lot of time, but can be exciting, and that's the fun, creative bit almost. I mean, the shooting is, you shoot what you think you are going to need, and then you find, as you put it together, that the story that you're telling is actually not quite, I don't know, that's my experience as a non-fiction kind of documentary filmmaker, I suppose.
Are there any questions in the room or online? There's a question over there.
Hi, good afternoon. While I was listening to the dialogue, I remember a French philosopher, André Malraux, when he wrote about the imaginary museum. And I was thinking, since when you're recording like an artwork, or the way when someone is producing, if these choices and how to do it doesn't go closer to this practice that André Malraux is describing, the imaginary museum, of recreating basically this artwork and bringing details that are not exactly the artist intention, thinking the whole artwork, but it's unfolding and unfolding the artwork in certain ways that becomes other suddenly.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds, I'll definitely pursue that reference. That sounds really interesting. Yeah, any act of editing something together becomes a confection, right? It becomes something new. We all are aware of how much we can be manipulated by audiovisual footage, right? And becoming more and more suspicious of it. But yes, I think that specifically the ability with paintings to kind of zoom and fragment does mean that the painting gets experienced in a different way from how it would if you're standing in front of it in a gallery space, certainly, which I think is productive. Some artists might think, no, thank you. I'm not sure how thrilled George was with what I did to that painting, but yeah, that's a great point, thank you.
Did you not, excuse me, can I just pick you up on that? You said, I'm not quite sure how thrilled. What was the artist's response?
He said, of all those films, there were 4 films made for PMC at Yale about him, and he said mine made him feel the most uncomfortable. I think that's good. That's part of my job, isn't it? But it does. I was thinking earlier from earlier papers about care, and actually I was going to say the opposite thing, that, and you'll know this as well, as you're right. As a producer, care is a great deal kind of on your mind, taking care of your collaborators, the crew, but also the subjects or the participants in a film. You have a legal duty of care as well as a kind of ethical and good citizen-friendly duty of care. So making sure, if George had said, in fact I did film stuff that he was really uncomfortable with, and he said don't use it, and I didn't. So there is, I guess I was flippant about him not loving the film. He was fine with the film. But yeah, care is another question to do with responsibility. Yeah.
I was just going to add to that because I'm in the process of making a short film about another archive that was shown at Tate, the Topher Campbell archive, and also it's a different ballgame when you're working on a context or maybe artwork by a living artist who may not or may have involvement with the work as well, and thinking about how do you bring in care. Obviously, they're very apparent with their ethics, and even just researching in the way they've made their work, you can understand sort of the ethos, and we wanted to bring that to light with the work, but we didn't have the access to the artist to be able to check over certain ideas and the presentation of the work. But it's also kind of a challenge because it is your film work as well. Yeah. So how do you kind of toe the line of respecting both?
I think that's a really key point actually about this duality between the artist's artwork and your film work. And Lily, you just said, about coming closer to the artwork. I'm not I wonder if you do get closer to the artwork or closer to the film work, because I think there is this kind of tension between the meaning and aim of what you're doing. And I wonder, as you think more and more about the film making, what you actually get closer to is filmmaking rather than art making.
Well, yes, because I'm a filmmaker, not an artist, right? So I think that's, obviously, there's another school of artist film that you're closer to, right? I think that's true. I think I'm concerned with the kind of experience of the artwork. I mean, certainly if there are interesting people to talk to around that, such as George, who's excellent at talking, all the better. But mine is a sort of consumer experience, right? In a way, it's me experiencing the artwork and thinking, how can I convey that? What are the interesting things about that I want to expand on and sort of take for a walk, as it were, within the film? So I'll take that.
I think in my practice I try to be really specific because of the distinction between artist moving image and maybe documentation and also filmmaking. I think they kind of sit in the same family but like siblings maybe, where they can be quite different. And I think with each of those practice, there's a specific intent, or maybe I try to compartmentalize it in that way, because when working with artists moving image, it isn't artwork in itself, and there are different ideas, different intents that you're trying to bring to light. Perhaps it becomes a medium in the same way as painting or any other artistic practice, that they're kind of reshaping, creating to bring different ideas that are you're not able to bring through language. Whereas with documentation of an artwork, it's more recreating or replicating maybe the relationship between space, body, movement, which I find maybe slightly different to filmmaking as well. So I think for me personally, I have those like different categorizations of it.
Yes, in the back row.
Thanks both for the presentations, and thanks Lily. I mean, I do think that what you said about the camera not quite finding its way and kind of being sort of this tremor of the camera, it's really what the artist was describing as the work being alive and kind of and not exact, sort of partly unfinished. And so I think that was so appropriate. But I was wondering if it's such a, sorry, and that's for you, I don't see you very well, if it's such a schism between documentation and filmmaking. I mean, that's, I think, also the relation between the artist or the one who creates a movement, the performance, the exhibition, and the film and the filmmaker, the one who documents. I've had the experience of working in this way, and we work really closely with a filmmaker, and he has access to the whole process, so to the process, to the production, to what is behind, and somehow this begins to give a flavor to how the work is perceived. And yeah, I think, and it's always a little bit, it's the work and the space, but it's also how the work is seen through the lens and the sensitivity of the other. And I just kind of feel that they are not so far apart, these two worlds. So it's more of a comment than but I'm sort of wonder if you feel this can be brought together somehow.
I do think
Thanks.
They kind of can move between different spaces, but maybe for me as well, it's just like the different spaces that they sit in as well. So I would probably say someone who's very conscious of how their work is perceived, in that sense, maybe sits more in like artist moving image, because they're an artist, they're thinking about how their work is like consumed, where it will sit, different presentations of it, which is kind of a bit more different to someone predominantly just making short films that go for festival runs and screenings in cinema. Maybe that's more my thinking. I think the reason why I try to be a bit specific and maybe think about it in that way is because I'm mostly working with emerging artists as well, who are still coming into their practice and maybe are also just shy about calling themselves artists. So trying to advocate for them to, like, you know, own those spaces as well, which I think is really important, particularly at like very early into your career. And I think being very specific about being a moving image artist and, you know, occupying spaces that may not be, you may not feel are for you, or you feel represented in, and like actually accessing funding and things like that, because I think maybe that's where I'm coming from as well when I'm thinking about these in different worlds.
Thank you.
Can we just check, are there any online questions? No, okay then, sorry. There's a question then at the back, and then... Did you?
Thank you both. It was really interesting to think of film as a site of archive, document, and of theatre, because film is, relatively new art format when we look at the whole history of art. And I think often people forget that it has so much potential for the artist, as you just mentioned, to explore and control the narrative, create a fiction, but then also control the narrative and create a document, a testimony to themselves. So I just applaud you both for looking at film, and I think it just needs a lot more discussion and also perhaps categorizing.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to kind of have a sense of the spectrum of filmmaking that can kind of live in this area of you know, the artwork. So from something that is, you know, quite a straightforward film of an exhibition, probably with lots of rostrum work and close-ups and things like that, to something that is much more reflective on its own practice, which, you know, one might call a kind of essay film or videographic practice, you know, where actually it becomes almost a kind of autonomous object, doesn't it, rather than linked, you know, with the artwork, you know, closely linked to the artwork.
Yeah. Certainly, I mean, I really value random old films I find on YouTube that have been made in some kind of exhibition context, or, you know, they've been made with a little pocket of funding somewhere, and they just illuminate. They couldn't have been made any other way. And I wish for my films to do that in 25 years' time, and someone to be like, oh, that's what I want. That's like the ultimate afterlife for me, would be to inhabit the random niche in the internet, but then get thrown up to some unsuspecting 19-year-olds.
You better hope then that the hardware doesn't change
I
too
better
much.
get better algorithms. Definitely.
I mean, can I also? I mean, this will sound like a plug, and it's not a plug, but the PMC does run this really interesting sort of project and competition for undergraduate students called British Art in Motion. And they receive training, they apply, they receive training and make films about artworks. And they're really interesting. I've been on, you know, in the past on the panel for assessing these. And the very best of them use editing and sound to produce a kind of new perspective. And I suspect that, you know, we will be using these kind of outputs for assessing, you know, degree programs and courses and so on, because actually it's very democratic. You know, if you have a phone, you can probably begin to make a film, right? Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm also involved in teaching 20-year-olds who are committed to filmmaking, but also those who are less schooled in it. And of course, they are all schooled in it by virtue of their age and their generation and their phones. So I think it is a really good idea to begin to fold that into certainly humanities, but maybe more broadly, sort of higher education curricula, or not just higher education as well, sixth form and so on. Because it's a mode in which so many people get their news now, right? It's such a huge sort of entertainment form, casual viewing form. My 13-year-old is constantly on YouTube Shorts and so on. They have this great literacy of it that we as older people don't have, but they also, so they need to kind of learn how to use it responsibly as well. Yeah.
I was going to add as well, it was making me think about an exhibition I worked on quite a while ago by Emma Bassi Okon, and within their practice they have loads of feminists, but they create their own sort of terms, and one term that stuck out to me was to thrive in spite of. So the idea of like being from a marginalised community, being able to thrive or make the best situation from the littles that you have. So I always advocate for particularly emerging filmmakers or moving image artists, because there's almost no funding in filmmaking anymore, to really think about like what do you have access to and how can you use that to tell the story, the narrative that you want to. And so many people just take like shorts from or archive from YouTube or random sources to create sort of mockumentaries and things like that, which I always think when you have limited resources, people make the best stuff anyway.
Hi. I'm wondering whether it's less a question of what's lost and what's gained, and more about what this in-between space, or how this in-between space can be generative. What struck me about the footage of Anthea Hamilton's project was how it's located in time and space. It's through the window of the Zoom, it locates it within the pandemic, and the fact that it took place in Minneapolis locates it within a post-George Floyd, or time-stamped. It's time-stamped by both of those events. So wondering how where context sort of comes into your work, or whether you think about sort of context in which the work is made.
Yes, I think context is really important, and I think, you know, the decision, obviously you were showing those within the Zoom frame window, right, in a particular exhibition context, let's say, that reveals, as you pointed out, that context. I think all those decisions that are made when you're putting together a film are, very important, carefully considered. That said, there are things that sometimes work better outside the frame of the film that you explain alongside, I think, in some cases, like an accompanying statement, that kind of thing. So I think it's very important, but it really depends on the situation of each particular film.
I was going to say it's also dependent on the artist's intention. I think so many artists, their work is rooted in the context and maybe the political situation they find themselves, whereas for some it's not so important. So I think it's always trying to think, like when I was coming up with this presentation, it was making me think about what the exhibition is. And for Anthea, I think her exhibition is always about her, like the intentions that are there. So it was really hard to kind of gather that in the documentation of the film, of the performances, because there's no speaking from the artist. The artist wasn't present. Yeah.
I think we probably have time for just one more, if there is another. Yeah. Last question, though.
Thank you. Super interesting and beautiful work. I just wanted to pick up on, Lily, you started by saying that, sort of suggesting that exhibition could be seen as a form, that filmmaking could be seen as a form of exhibiting. And immediately, I guess I thought of Mika Baal's exhibition as film essay, and thinking about how we use filmic tropes to think through an exhibition. Not to say that it isn't a film, and so I'm thinking the other way around, and for both of you, whether you see your films as borrowing from exhibitionary techniques, or I guess I want to probably say curatorial. So do you see them as curatorial films? Do you see them as being in a kind of narrative film tradition or an essay film tradition, or do you also see them as actually borrowing or working with kind of tropes of curatorial practice?
Yes.
Come on, it's just a set, just sum it up.
It's not something I've thought about. I think a lot of the films I make as a producer are rooted in art history and maybe related to that. I'm not sure if I thought about the films I make as like borrowing from curatorial practices, actually.
No. I think when I began, like with Fallen Women, I was very concerned, like that was very linked to the exhibition. I sought you, Lynn, Vicky as well was involved in that film, to give the sort of curatorial, or to contribute a curatorial narrative to it, which I kind of followed and enhanced, I think, in that for me. And as I've matured in my filmmaking practice over the last 10 years, I'm less sort of bothered about that, because I think that has been done. Of course, I'm going to be influenced and responding to ideas that were brought up in the exhibition or expressed in essays or by the curators, and they'll inform like the direction I go in, but I think it's less important that my job is a different one. I've just worked with Vicky making the film about the David Parr house, where the relationship with her as the scholar and the researcher who was furnishing a lot of the content, bringing the quotes that we use, all the sort of intellectual and cultural context around Parr, but that kind of enabled me to just be quite free in how I put it together and express things. So I think in answer to your question, it's unconsciously influenced by curatorial practices, but less and less consciously.
So I think they're both curatorial.
I think we must finish it there, but can I thank you for your questions and also ask you to join me in thanking the two panellists again.